Ask someone to name the members of Pink Floyd. They will say Roger Waters. They will say David Gilmour. They will say Syd Barrett, even though Syd left the band in 1968. They might say Nick Mason if they know their music. Almost nobody says Rick Wright, and Rick Wright was the sound. Not the lyrics, those were Roger's. Not the guitar, that was David's. Not the drums, those were Nick's. Rick Wright played keyboards, organ, and synthesizer. He played the Farfisa on Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun. He played the Fender Rhodes on Us and Them. He played the Hammond on Echoes. He played the ethereal vocal-like synthesizer Wash that opens Shine on You, Crazy Diamond. He was the atmosphere. He was the air between the notes. And because atmosphere is invisible, so was he. If you have ever listened to The Dark Side of the Moon, and 45 million people have, making it one of the best-selling albums in history, you have heard Rick Wright. The warm wash of organ beneath Breathe, the floating piano chords that carry The Great Gig in the Sky before Claire Torrey's vocal enters, the slow, patient liturgical organ that holds us and them together like a cathedral ceiling. That is Rick Wright. That is the sound nobody saw. Rick Wright would have been 83 years old today. He died in September 2008 at 65 of cancer. David Gilmour said afterwards, "In many ways, Rick's keyboards and voice were the sound of Pink Floyd." If the man who played guitar in the band says the keyboards were the sound, and the world still can't remember the keyboard player's name, what does that tell you about how we listen to music? Richard William Wright was born in Hatch End, Middlesex, in 1943. His father was a biochemist. His mother played piano. The house was quiet, educated, suburban, the kind of English middle-class home that produced architects and civil servants. Rick was studying architecture at the Regent Street Polytechnic in London when he met Roger Waters and Nick Mason, who were studying at the same institution. Syd Barrett arrived soon after. He was the charismatic one, the painter, the poet, the beautiful mad boy who could hold a room without trying. Roger was the angry one, Nick was the reliable one, and Rick was the one who could actually play. He was the only member of the early Pink Floyd who had formal musical training. He could read a score. He could write chord progressions that moved through unexpected keys without ever sounding forced. He understood harmony the way an architect understands load-bearing walls. The early Pink Floyd, 1966-1967, was Syd Barrett's band. The light shows, the improvisation, the space rock identity that made them famous at the UFO Club and the Roundhouse. That was Syd. But underneath Syd's melodies, holding the harmonic structure together, keeping the improvisations from collapsing into noise, was Rick Wright's organ. Quiet, careful, invisible, doing the structural work that nobody noticed until it was gone. When Syd left the band in 1968, pushed out by his own mind, destroyed by LSD and fame and the specific cruelty of a world that loved his strangeness until it became real, Pink Floyd lost its frontman, its songwriter, and its visual identity in one day. Most bands would have ended. Pink Floyd did not end. They kept going because the structure was still there. The structure was Rick. What does it mean to be the foundation of a building that everybody looks at, but nobody photographs from below? Rick Wright was about to find out for the next 40 years. Between 1970 and 1975, Pink Floyd made the albums that defined them: Atom Heart Mother, Metal, The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here. Every one of these records is built on Rick Wright's keyboards, the way a cathedral is built on its foundation stones. You do not see them, but if you removed them, everything above would collapse. Echoes, the 23-minute centerpiece of metal, 1971. The piece begins with a single Rick Wright piano note that has been processed through a Leslie speaker to sound like a sonar ping from the bottom of the ocean. That note, that specific, eerie, underwater note, is one of the most recognizable sounds in progressive rock history. Rick found it by accident playing around with the studio equipment. He kept it because he understood that accidents are where the best sounds live. The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. 45 million copies sold. 950 weeks on the Billboard chart. The album that turned Pink Floyd from a cult band into one of the biggest acts on Earth. Listen to Breathe. The warm organ bed beneath Gilmour's guitar is Rick. Listen to The Great Gig in the Sky. The chords that Claire Torrey improvises over are Rick's composition. Listen to Us and Them. The entire song is a Rick Wright piano piece that Roger Waters added lyrics to. Rick wrote the music, Roger wrote the words. The world remembers Roger's words. The world does not remember who wrote the music underneath them. Wish You Were Here, 1975. Shine on You Crazy Diamond, the 9-part suite dedicated to Syd Barrett. The opening is one of the most famous beginnings in rock music, a slow, shimmering synthesizer wash that sounds like sunrise through fog. That is Rick Wright, 4 notes on a mini-moog, played slowly with the filter opening and closing like a breath. It takes nearly 2 minutes before Gilmour's guitar enters. For 2 minutes, the entire band, one of the biggest bands on Earth, sits in silence and lets the keyboard player set the mood. That is who Rick Wright was. He was the 2 minutes before the guitar. He was the air in the room. He was the reason the room existed at all. By the late 1970s, Roger Waters had taken control of Pink Floyd. The Wall, the 1979 double album, the arena show, the film, was Roger's vision, Roger's lyrics, Roger's concept. He was the auteur. The rest of the band were, in his view, hired musicians executing his ideas, and the one he pushed hardest against was Rick. Roger said Rick was not contributing enough. He said Rick's playing had become lazy. He said Rick was not bringing material to the sessions. The truth was more complicated. Rick was going through a difficult divorce. He was struggling with the pressure of the sessions, and the creative space inside Pink Floyd had shrunk to the width of Roger Waters' ego. There was no room left for Rick's atmospheric instincts. Roger wanted control. Rick needed space. The two things could not coexist. In 1979, Roger Waters fired Rick Wright from Pink Floyd. The man whose keyboards had built the sound of The Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, and Animals, was told he was no longer a member of the band he had co-founded in 1965. He was allowed to continue playing on the Wall tour, but only as a salaried session musician, not as a partner. And here is the irony that makes this story worth telling. The Wall tour lost money. It was so expensive to produce. The giant wall built on stage every night, the projections, the inflatables, the puppets, that the tour ended in the red. Every member of Pink Floyd who was a partner in the band lost money on the tour. The only member who made money was Rick Wright, because he was being paid a fixed salary as a hired musician. Roger Waters fired Rick Wright from his own band, and Rick Wright was the only one who got paid. The man who built the sound was fired for not contributing enough. The man who was fired was the only one who made money. If music history teaches you anything, it teaches you that the people who hold the structure together are the last to be thanked and the first to be removed. Roger Waters left Pink Floyd in 1985, believing the band could not continue without him. He was wrong. David Gilmour and Nick Mason kept the name, and the first thing they did was bring Rick Wright back. A momentary lapse of reason, 1987. Rick was back behind the keyboards. The album sold 4 million copies. The tour sold out arenas across the world. Roger Waters sued, claiming the name Pink Floyd belonged to him. He lost. The courts ruled that Pink Floyd was a band, not a solo project. Rick Wright was, once again, a full member. The Division Bell, 1994. Rick Wright co-wrote several tracks. His keyboards were central again. The warm, atmospheric, patient sound that had been missing from the Waters-era records. Wearing the Inside Out featured Rick's lead vocal, one of the few Pink Floyd songs where the Invisible Man stepped to the front of the stage and sang. David Gilmour said it simply, Rick was the musical heartbeat of Pink Floyd. The minute he came back, it sounded right again. Gilmour, the guitarist, the man most people assumed was the sonic architect of the band, was saying publicly that the real architect had always been the quiet man behind the keyboards. Pink Floyd played their last ever live performance on July 2nd, 2005 at Live 8 in Hyde Park. All 4 surviving members, including Roger Waters, on stage together for the first time in 24 years. Rick Wright was there behind the keyboards where he had always been. The crowd of 200,000 people cheered for Roger. They cheered for David. They cheered for the songs. Almost nobody cheered for Rick. He did not seem to mind. Rick Wright died on September 15, 2008, at his home in London. He was 65 years old. He had been privately battling cancer. He had not told the public. He had not made a farewell statement. He had simply continued to live quietly, the way he had always lived, without asking anyone to look at him. David Gilmour released a statement that said what the world should have said for 40 years. In many ways, Rick's keyboards and voice were the sound of Pink Floyd. Roger Waters, the man who had fired him, released his own statement. He was a gentle, genuine man, and I will miss him. Nick Mason said, "We have lost one of our own." 3 men who had spent decades fighting each other, agreeing for once on one thing: Rick Wright had been the sound. In 2014, 6 years after Rick's death, Pink Floyd released The Endless River, an album built almost entirely from Rick Wright's unreleased keyboard sessions. Gilmour and Mason had gone through the archive of recordings from the Division Bell sessions and found hours of Rick playing alone at the piano, the organ, the synthesizer. They built an album around those recordings. It was the last Pink Floyd album. It was Rick Wright's album, and it debuted at #1 in 17 countries. The Invisible Man, the one whose name nobody says when they list the members of the band. The one who was fired from his own group, the one who made the only money on the tour that lost everything, the one who, 6 years after his death, had an album built around his unreleased recordings, and it went to #1. That is Rick Wright, the sound nobody saw. Rick Wright would have been 83 years old today. He played keyboards in one of the biggest bands in the history of recorded music. He co-wrote some of the most recognizable pieces of music ever made. He was fired from his own band and was the only one who got paid. He came back. He was there for the last concert. He died quietly, at home, without asking for attention. And 6 years later, an album of his unreleased recordings went to #1 in 17 countries. If you have ever pressed play on Dark Side of the Moon and felt the room change around you, felt the air shift, felt the walls soften, felt the ordinary world recede for 43 minutes, that was Rick Wright. That was the sound nobody saw, doing the work that nobody noticed, holding the whole cathedral together from underneath. The next time someone asks you to name the members of Pink Floyd, say his name first, Rick Wright, the sound of Pink Floyd. Subscribe. We do this every day.